Well, good morning. Welcome to Aletheia Church. My name is Kevin. I'm one of the pastors here. If you haven't had the chance to meet me, we're glad you're here and glad to have you here with us this morning. If you have a child of elementary school age, you may dismiss them at this time to their lesson time. Their teachers will be at the back. And I want to go ahead and put a disclaimer out this morning for those of you that tend to keep your kids in during the service. You're more than welcome to do that. But this morning, our themes kind of will include adultery, sexual immorality, and divorce. And so if that's something you wanted to not have to address with your kids maybe after the sermon, we would love for your children to go away to the classroom time this morning. So turn over to Matthew chapter 5. That's where we'll be. If you have not had an opportunity yet to have one of our scripture journals and would like one, just raise your hand. We've got some volunteers around here that would love to give one to you. If you don't know what that is, it's just the text of scripture that we're going through right now, and then the opportunity to take notes and go along with it if you want. It's our free gift to you. We believe strongly in God's word here and that the power that it has to impact our lives. And so anyway, if you would like one, just raise your hand, and one of our volunteers would love to give one of those to you. And the reason why we're going through Matthew 5 is we're actually working through this entire fall, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And what we've been seeing as we've been working through this sermon now for about 4 weeks is that what Jesus is doing in this sermon is he's giving a description to his disciples, even though there are other people there, but he's teaching specifically to his disciples, his followers, those that would have called themselves disciples of Jesus. And he's describing to them this concept of what he calls the kingdom of heaven. It's what he claims he has been sent to earth to do on mission from his heavenly Father. And it is the invitation that he's extended to his disciples and to anyone else who's following him. And in this description, what we're seeing as we move through it is that really what Jesus is doing is he's taking Jewish standards and traditions and he's basically turning them completely upside down. He's teaching and saying that the ways in which the world, but also subsequently common everyday Jewish teaching and thought has become misaligned or misinterpreted or misunderstands what God's meaning and intent is inside of the Old Testament law and prophets. We saw a couple weeks ago that Jesus made this kind of profound statement as he is in this sermon stating that he is the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. And so what he means by that is he has both come to fulfill the law, obey the law, teach the law properly, and also fulfill all the promises that God had made to his people for hundreds and even thousands of years of how he was going to rescue and redeem them. And so Jesus is making some really, really bold claims, and he's inviting his disciples and future disciples to this understanding so that we might live and flourish in light of an ethic that is aligned with God and his ethics, not with what mankind decides what right and wrong is. And so last week, Pastor Theo started a section that we're going to be in for about 5 weeks, where we are looking at specific Jewish Old Testament laws or teachings that Jesus is presenting and then immediately correcting. And Jesus gives a total in Matthew's gospel of 6 examples of where Jesus' commands in the Old Testament have been misinterpreted or are being interpreted in a way that doesn't capture the essence of what God was trying to get across to his people when he created and instituted the law of Moses. And last week, right, we started off with this idea of murder, right? And Jesus, you're going to see this regular pattern throughout the next several weeks as we look at this text of Jesus is going to say something along the lines of, you have heard it said. And then he's going to respond with, but I say to you. So he's going to take the common interpretation and then he's going to speak with authority saying, actually, this is how it is. You've completely gotten it wrong, and here's how. And so last week, right, he tackled the 6th commandment. You've heard it said that you should not murder. And Jesus says, it goes a lot deeper than that. It's not just murder, but if you have anger in your heart towards a brother, you've already committed murder and therefore guilty. And Theo walked through examples of why anger is such a problem and how we can be challenged to think through that as followers of Jesus and why Jesus is probing at the heart here. But today we're going to look at actually two separate examples that kind of fit together in some ways. And the first one that Jesus is going to tackle is adultery. And the second one is going to be divorce. And we're going to see over the course of this sermon and ones to come, this theme consistently is going to pop up where Jesus is going to probe at our heart, not just external adherence to rules. That Jesus seems to indicate to us that the issues we struggle with and strive against, maybe even sometimes, are so much deeper than whether we just do right or wrong. But where is our heart process at? Where is our mind at? How are we thinking? How are we processing? And how do we do that? And let me maybe just break this down for just a second, because this is going to be important to understanding future sermons as well. Humans are regularly tempted to legislate morality and keep up external appearances to show how good we are, to be acceptable maybe inside of society or inside of a people group or whatever that may be. It's just something we do. And there's some good reasons for that. Like legislating murder is a good idea. Like I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. But the reality is when we attempt to view morality simply as external behavior, the problem becomes superficial and ultimately is going to lead to issues down the line. Like for example, in Pastor Theo's sermon last week on murder, if we legislate murder as a crime and we give jail or the death penalty, what drives behavior and motivates people to not murder others, and I'm not saying in all situations, but what often can drive this is the fear of punishment or reprisal for the action, not an actual desire to do the right thing and honor God and honor others and love them because they're made in the image and likeness of God. And what Jesus is getting at as we work through this section of the Sermon on the Mount is he's teaching his disciples that the problems that we have in not obeying God's law run far deeper than just the external actions that we commit. That the external action of murder is much deeper than just, oh, I chose to strike that person or shoot that person or stab that person or suffocate that person, whatever it might be. That the action was precipitated by something much deeper inside of our heart that was bitterness, resentful, anger, frustration, selfishness, that there's so many things that contribute to this. And it is a heart issue where if anger and envy and selfishness and bitterness towards someone grow and fester, it eventually can manifest itself in the action of actually carrying out murdering somebody. It's why even inside of our court system, you see a delineation between things like premeditated murder and manslaughter. Because there is a difference between the two. Even though premeditation is an extremely difficult thing to actually prove, because how many of us are in someone else's heart or mind other than our own? And sometimes we don't even want to be in our own, right? And so therefore, right, Jesus is teaching we don't just want to keep ourselves from murder. We need to do the hard work of examining our hearts and motives towards others, because that's what God is actually after. He's after people that love him and therefore love others, and in that love probe far deeper in their own hearts for where they're moving astray from the word of God rather than just their external obedience. And today, Jesus is going to challenge another thing that people in his day struggled with, but it's probably going to be a topic that hits a little bit closer to home. He's going to talk about adultery and ultimately lust and the idea of divorce. And so here's where I'm going to attempt to take us this morning. As I was preparing this message this past week, I realized that I could probably have preached about 5 different messages. on this topic. But here's where I think the Lord wants us to go this morning, and we'll see what he wants to do with it. And hopefully it will be both convicting and encouraging to us this morning as we see kind of what Jesus is saying in this sermon, right? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to see Jesus challenging the status quo. And we're going to attempt to unpack Jesus' correction on Jewish interpretation of adultery and divorce. Then we're going to move in and we're going to try to answer this question. Why does God care? Which I think is an extremely important question. And I would go so far as to say tends to be the area in which those of us that would call ourselves disciples and followers of Jesus tend to really struggle. We often are answering questions that people aren't asking when we say that God has these standards about certain things. We try to assume what questions are being asked, and we need to instead answer the question, why does God care about who we sleep with, what we're doing, who we're married to, and why does that marriage matter? And ultimately, what we're going to see, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag here for a second, is this idea of the reason why God cares is he's after your good and your flourishing. That God creates rules and designs, commands and structures for his people because he wants his people to live lives that are full of love, purpose, and meaning. That God doesn't create commands for his people to rob them of joy, but actually to allow them to experience joy in its fullness in a way that we would never be able to experience on our own apart from him. And then lastly, we're going to maybe seek to figure out what does it look like to move forward in light of what Jesus is saying here, right? And it's going to be a call to repentance. It's going to be a call to experience the grace of God, and it's going to be a call to rest and find ourselves in contentment with where God has us. And so let's turn over to Matthew chapter 5 if you're not there already. And I want to go ahead and start with this idea of Jesus challenging the status quo inside of Jewish culture and society. And look at what he has to say in verses 27 and 28 of Matthew chapter 5. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Right, so if you want to know what Jesus is doing here, right, if you look at verse 27, right, he starts off with that saying, "You have heard it said," and he's quoting different pieces of the Old Testament. He's quoting from Exodus chapter 20, verse 14. Let me read that real quick for you. If you don't know what this is one of the 10 commandments. He says, "You shall not commit adultery." He's also paraphrasing Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 18. But this is the 7th commandment. Right? And so if you can't see what Jesus is doing, last week was the 6th commandment. This week is the 7th commandment. He's going to present each commandment to them. And he says, "You've heard it said that you should not commit adultery," which, by the way, is 100% what they had heard because it's written in God's word. However, right, he then goes on to say, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Now, there's some things going on here culturally and historically that might get missed on us, so I want to explain some things that Jesus is probably pressing on that would not make a ton of sense to us today because it's not how we operate. But in the ancient world, especially like in the Greek and Roman world, in the ancient Near East, married men were allowed to have sexual adventures even if they were married, as long as the women they were sleeping with were unmarried. So it wasn't considered adultery as long as the woman was unmarried that they were sleeping with. Women, however, needed to remain chaste before marriage and then after. And if you're sitting there thinking that's the double standard, yes, it was. Okay, I didn't create it. Don't shoot the messenger. It's the way it was. Okay, we don't live there now, so we don't need to be mad about it. But that's what the rules were. Now, Jesus, if you can't tell then, knowing that cultural understanding of how adultery was treated, specifically amongst the men in the group who would have been listening to Jesus and were his 12 disciples, think about how much different this lands with what Jesus is saying here. I mean, he is immediately going on the offensive in multiple ways, challenging the common acceptance of sexual ethics during his day and time. I mean, look at even like the language that he uses here, right? He doesn't say, if you are a married man who looks at a woman with lustful intent. Who does he say? Everyone, right? He uses the universal language actually for people there. Now, he's addressing the men most predominantly because we already know culturally there would have been a different understanding for the standard of women that would have been closer to what Jesus' standard is. But he's saying, hey, whether you are a married or an unmarried man, you can commit adultery simply by lusting after another woman. And just so we're clear, this stands for women as well, but as I mentioned earlier, they already have a different standard. But he's speaking to everyone. And he doesn't just go after the action, right? Notice how he's challenging the heart again, the same way he did with murder. He's saying mere external obedience to God's intent with the seventh commandment is not what God is after. He's saying something much deeper here that we all must wrestle with. God demands a level of holiness among his people, where sexual intimacy is viewed as a gift from God, but to be enjoyed only inside the confines of heterosexual monogamous marriage. I mean, you kind of get the sense that as Jesus is talking here, he's being brought back to even what Job was saying while he was arguing with his friends in Job chapter 31. Look at what Job says. He says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? We're like, Job had this heart for God, as we see throughout his book of the Old Testament, where he's saying, my commitment to holiness before God doesn't just involve my external obedience to not committing adultery against my wife, but to actually make a covenant with the Lord, with my eyes, to not look on another woman lustfully. And I want to make something clear here, because it's going to get really challenging here in just a second, right? Everything that Jesus is saying here is a direct kick to the teeth to the way our culture lives and teaches sexual ethics. If you agree with what the world teaches on sexual ethics, you are not a fan of Jesus. I'm telling you that right now. You are not. And I want to make something abundantly clear. Either we believe what Jesus says or we don't. There is no lukewarm. We don't get to pull the Thomas Jefferson where we pick and choose the things that Jesus says that we like and we follow those and don't follow the others. Jesus calls that being lukewarm, and he spits you out. And I'm not saying that to try to be mean, but I'm saying it prophetically, that I do not want you to sit here this morning and sit here and believe as if it's okay to ignore what Jesus says about this stuff when it is not. Because I do you no service in teaching this to you. And what Jesus is saying here is actually way deeper than adultery, because I know what we do, because this is exactly what the Jews were doing, right? If you think about it, right, men saying, well, I can commit adultery as long as it's not with a married woman because she's not committing adultery and so it's okay, right? Which has all sorts of implications of viewing women as property and being able to do what you want and trying to find loopholes in the law and trying to work their way around it. I mean, we could just sit here all day talking about all the ways that they were trying to get around what Jesus was actually saying. But the reality is this. The word adultery there, right, is the word for married men committing adultery. But there are two other places. When you get down to verse 32, right, of Matthew chapter 5, Jesus doesn't use the word adultery there. He actually uses the word sexual immorality. Meaning he's tying these two ideas together, this idea of adultery and sexual immorality. And if you go over to Ephesians chapter 5, right, Paul, who's teaching on this as well in verse 3, and just what it looks like to be a Christian and live amongst Christian community and the standards we should hold for one another, look what he says in verse 3. He says, but sexual immorality and all impurity or covetousness must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints. Now that word sexual immorality in the Greek is a Greek word known as porneia. Sound familiar? Right, it's where we get our word pornography from. And the word in the Greek literally carries with the connotations with it of any number of sexual acts that a human mind could devise that are not supposed to be committed outside of monogamous heterosexual marriage. We're talking about sex before marriage, sexual intimacy before marriage, lust, pornography, strip clubs, sexting. I could probably list another 30 things. Are we tracking where I'm going with this here, though? Right, that this is a junk drawer term for anything outside the bounds of healthy sexual intimacy inside of marriage. And so the standard that Jesus is giving here is extremely high. Hey, look, God cares deeply, as we're going to see in a minute, about marriage and about how that intimacy is enjoyed inside of marriage. And that intimacy was created by God to be enjoyed inside of marriage for our good and his glory. And when it is pulled out of that, all sorts of problems start being created. And if you think that's not true, if you think God's off on this, I would submit to you, look at the confusion surrounding sexual identity in our current day and age. Addiction to pornography, serial adultery, confusion over gender and attraction. The list could be endless, and it's rooted in sin, but it goes much deeper than that because we don't realize this. We are all byproducts of something called the sexual revolution. And one of the biggest things that the sexual revolution has discipled into our psyche and to the psyche of our parents and our grandparents without us realizing it is that the most important marker of identification inside of us is who we're sleeping with and whether we're receiving sexual fulfillment in some way, shape, or form. And Jesus is trying to get across to the men who are sitting before him, your identity is rooted in something so much deeper than who you're sleeping with and whether you're sexually satisfied or not. That I have created human beings for so much more than something like that. That you are exchanging the glory of God and being a citizen of his kingdom for something so much cheaper. For something so much less than you could be experiencing. Jesus is ultimately saying to his disciples here, your standards are too low. Your desire for external obedience is not good enough. Not because it doesn't make you enough, it's because your desires are too weak. You don't desire strongly enough. And what God desires from his people is that they hold to a healthy view of sexual intimacy inside of marriage with their spouse, because that is what leads to lasting joy and peace. Flourishing. Being a citizen of the kingdom of God leads to true joy. And in case you haven't gotten it yet, right, that Jesus is super serious about this, right? Look at what he says in verses 29 and 30. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. You know, being a pastor in a college town, I get the opportunity to speak regularly on this topic with people that are dating, people that are soon to be married, people that are married. You know, it's one of the joys of getting to do the type of ministry we get. And if I had to summarize the consistent question I get from people when it's questions regarding biblical sexual ethics, I could sum it up in one question. How far is too far? I get asked a question that is somewhere along those lines. And the first thing I tell people when I start getting asked that question is like, that's the wrong question. It's the wrong question. It's kind of like, how close can I play with the hydrochloric acid before it'll burn off my hand? It's like my kids when they're really little. How close can I get to the extremely hot 400-degree oven and play with it before it becomes a problem? It's like, well, we're not going to go near the oven, actually. It's a bad idea. Right? But because we have this insatiable desire inside of us, often warped by things we're bringing in, that tends to be where we run. Well, how far can I go? What is allowed? What is permissible? And Jesus seems instead to be setting an extremely high standard when it comes to what that question is. Right? Now, Jesus is not condoning maiming oneself here in verses 29 through 30, although there have been Christian traditions over the years that took so seriously what Jesus is saying here, where they would actually pluck out their eye or cut off their hand or whatever else. But what Jesus is doing is he's saying, hey, like when I'm saying that your view of sexual ethics is too low, and that when you look after a woman lustfully or commit sexual immorality, that you are creating a wedge between you and God and it's creating issues, I'm telling you, you need to take sin seriously. You need to be putting it to death actively. And if we follow the line of thinking that Jesus has been using up to this point in Matthew chapter 5, he's telling us to start internally with checking our heart and our internal motivations, which then leads to external action, gouging out our eye, cutting off our hand, so as not to sin. Let me give you an example of this, and I'm going to intentionally use a non-heavy one because I know a lot of what we're talking about this morning is extremely heavy, so maybe we can poke fun at me for just a minute in a non-heavy example of how this works itself out, right? All right, so Jesus says, hey, if your right eye or your right hand calls you to sin, cut it out and cast it off, right? Well, clearly you can see, it's still in my hand, right? Still in my eye, right? But if you don't know this about me, there's some people, especially my family sitting up here in the front, will attest to all this. I tend to be a little competitive about things that don't even matter. Just super, super competitive. And, one of the things that is true about like human beings is a lot of you guys like to do these things called board games. And when you guys want to play board games in social gatherings, you want to like play them and like have a good time and enjoy your time with one another. And then there's always that guy, me, who has to win at all costs and will burn 10-year friendships into the ground to win a game of Monopoly. I mean, ruthless, just like loan shark, right? Slumlord, right, at Monopoly. There you go. Thank you. And so in the early days, right, this precipitated, and Jackie is a big board game player. If you've ever looked at the board game closet at our house, it's ridiculous. It's supposed to be a linen closet. There's like 3 linens and 95 board games. And in the first year of our marriage, we're playing this board game, and I'm like huffing and puffing, and I'm losing, and eventually I lose, and I'm mad, and I just get up and kind of storm off. And she comes in, she's like, what's wrong with you? Like, it's just the two of us. Like, hello? Like, we're married. Like, and I was just like, I wanted to win. She's like, yeah, well, can't you be happy that I won? I'm like, what kind of question is that? Of course not. Like, absolutely not. Right? And she's like, well, can't you like just play a game to have fun? I'm like, winning is the fun. Like, am I missing something? Like, some of you guys may remember that NFL coach years and years ago who was the coach of the New York Jets, and they asked him, like, hey, was there a moral victory today, and like how badly you guys played and how few games you won? He's like, hello, you played to win the game. He got fired soon after that. by the way, right? But like I subscribe to his philosophy of life, right? I promise this story has a purpose, by the way. We're getting there. So I can't handle not having to win. Just not mature enough yet. So if you've hung out at my house and there are people playing board games, guess what I'm doing? Not playing the board game. Because I don't want to ruin your time. And God has called me to love you and to care about you. And because my right eye can't lose, cast it out. Right? I'd love to be able to play. Right? I would love to take Isaiah Fetterman down in a game of Settlers sometime, but I just can't do it because it wouldn't be healthy. Right? Now, this is a silly example, right? But it can be applied anywhere. Specifically to sexual ethics that Jesus is talking about here. And ultimately what Jesus is saying is like, look, your standards for what I desire for my people so they might experience joy are too low. You need to take sin more seriously. And if you can't handle being around something that causes you to sin, remove yourself from it. Right? Some of the people I've respected most in my life over the course of the last 15 to 20 years of being a Christian are people that struggle with sexual sins and do things like get rid of their phone or their computer. You know how hard it is to function in 2024 without a phone or a computer? You want to talk about taking the holiness of God seriously? I mean, intentionally making your life more difficult so they might experience the joy of walking with God. That's what Jesus is after here. And so he starts off by really just saying to us, like, look, the categories of sexual immorality that human beings find themselves in is far greater than your definition of what right and wrong is in application to what the seventh commandment is. And that people who are citizens of the kingdom of heaven take this seriously and are actively working to put it to death. And then he's going to go on to talk about marriage. Right, look at what he says in verses 31 and 32. He says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, this actually is not an Old Testament command, but is instead referring to something that Moses taught on in the Old Testament and was common practice in Jesus' day and age. Right? But basically, what people were doing in Moses' time, if a man was mad at his wife for some reason, he could send her away, divorce her, but he could choose to take her back at any time. And basically what this led to economically was ruin for the woman because she couldn't remarry and be provided for during that time. And so what Moses did, right, is he presented, right, says that, hey, if you send your wife away, if you try to divorce her, you must give her a certificate of divorce showing that you released her from your marriage so that she has the ability to remarry and be provided for and not be considered a widow. Now, what this ultimately was a protection for women, but one of the things that it did create is it created major allowances for men to be able to just concoct any reason that they wanted to divorce their wife and send them away. And Jesus, in responding to the common practice, even in that current day and age, is to say, but I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except on the grounds of sexual immorality, porneia, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Basically, what Jesus is saying here is when you get married, it is a lifelong union that's not supposed to be easily dissolved. Divorce is a big deal, and if you enter into a divorce, you create the opportunity of forcing others into adulterous relationships. Now, I don't have time to go deeper in this, but I just want to share it really quickly, right? Because Jesus does share an allowance there, right? And there are other ones as well, right? Jesus says that there's an allowance for divorce and remarriage on the grounds of sexual immorality. Paul talks about desertion in 1 Corinthians, and I think there's a good biblical case in 1 Corinthians as well for things like danger, violence, and domestic abuse. Okay? This could literally be its own sermon. That is it on what I'm going to say on that. But ultimately, people are always like, well, what if? What if I'm allowed? What if? Okay, there's your what ifs. But I want to get back to the idea of what Jesus' point that he's trying to get across to the disciples here that he's talking to. Divorce is not something God wants for his people. If two people get married before God and others, ultimately what Jesus is trying to say here is divorce should not be our first recourse. Right? Jesus actually teaches this on this again in Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. Let me share that story with you. It says, now when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by saying, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? So the Pharisees had a slightly different take on this, and this is the reason why they're asking this. They're trying to trap Jesus into what kind of like their view on it was. But look at how Jesus answered them. He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. They said to him, why did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? And he said to them, and this is important to notice, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Sound familiar? Right, see what Jesus is teaching here is just because Moses allowed you guys to divorce because of your own sinfulness and wickedness does not mean that that was God's original design and intention. That God was kind enough to create a way to protect women because of your sinfulness. But that's not God's design for marriage. Now, I love what the response to this is, right? Because he answers the Pharisees, and you get the sense that they don't have any answer, and they kind of go away. But look at this. Then the disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. And Jesus goes on to say, there are some who are eunuchs from birth, there are some who are eunuchs made by others, and there are some who are eunuchs that are made that way for the cause of the kingdom of heaven. And basically what Jesus is saying here is like, yes, some of you probably shouldn't get married because you can't handle it. Because it is a deeply impactful commitment. See, God takes a marriage covenant very seriously. Right? The world tells us just move on, be happy. Get out of it. There is no questioning where Jesus lands on this. Right? His disciples say literally, well, it's better not get married. This is so hard, it's better to not get married. Because God takes this so seriously. And so we see what Jesus has done here in these verses is he's completely turned upside down the world's thinking on sexual ethics and divorce. Which inevitably leads to the question of, well, why does God care? And it's rooted in God, the answer to that question is rooted in God's design for human beings and human flourishing in relationships. Right? And so we're going to start by looking at God's design for marriage and work our way back to lust. And my goal is that we'll present God's design for sexual intimacy and relationships. And so if we want to start with understanding why God cares so deeply about this and why God's so serious about how he talks about this, we need to understand that in his design of relationships, he created them a certain way and that therefore they're supposed to work in a certain way and we should know how they're supposed to look. And I want to first start off by saying, most of the time when Christians start talking about divorce and sexual ethics, we commit some fallacies of ethics. Or maybe not even fallacies, but we miss the most important point. Right? There's a Christian ethicist and theologian by the name of Lewis Smedes, right? he created this list when it comes to sexual ethics of where Christians often argue and make arguments for the biblical ethics from a place that's not as important as the one we're going to get to, right? And so 3 things that we tend to do when we view sexual ethics, right? We come at it from like a morality of caution, as he calls it. And what that means is you ask yourself the question, can this hurt me? Or can I get hurt by this? Right? And so we might say like, hey, adultery is bad. It can hurt you. Okay. It's not untrue, but is it the most important thing? Right? The second mistake we tend to make is we come at it solely from a morality of concern. Can this hurt others? Will this hurt them? Which, by the way, is 100% something we should consider. But it tends to be our primary argument. The third thing we tend to do is we come at it from a morality of personal relationship. Hey, is this going to harm my relationship with my mom, my dad, my friend, my girlfriend, my boyfriend, my husband, my wife? Can this create some sort of issue? Which again, all of these things are true, but when we make them the primary argument, it misses the point. Because when God designed men and women, and as we're going to see here in just a minute in Genesis chapter 2, we need to instead come at the answer to this question of the morality of design, or answer the question, what did God create this to be? Because even if it does no harm, we can still ask the question, is it good? There are all sorts of things that we can do that aren't harmful in and of themselves, that are not good. Right? If you are a student and you have a big exam tomorrow and you choose to sleep from 3 o'clock today until the start of that exam tomorrow, that's not going to harm anyone. It's going to harm your grade, but is it good? Probably not. But if we get down to the idea of design in that illustration, God has designed you and called you to be a student, meaning your primary vocation is to do well in school right now. Meaning you pursue that with excellence. And if we look at Genesis chapter 2, we see God's design for marriage. Right? Look at what God's word says in Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 23. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed." And so I'm stealing from a pastor by the name of Daniel Doriani when he breaks down what's going on here in Genesis chapter 2. But he says there's 3 things in God's design that we need to see here and understand God's creation for the institution of marriage. First is this. There's exclusive, and by the way, this is all centered around the idea of loyalty and commitment. Right? The first one is this. It's exclusive loyalty. Right? He says that the man shall leave his father and his mother, meaning that if you are married to somebody, that person becomes the most important person to you on this earth. You prioritize them. There's loyalty to them over family, friends, hobbies, and jobs. I cannot begin to describe to you the number of times Jackie and I are in a fight because I've given my loyalty to something other than her. Work, friends, hobbies. Guess how that makes her feel? Not great. And God designed this relationship to display this level of loyalty and intentionality and commitment to one another. And it's not just an exclusive loyalty. With that loyalty also comes the idea of lifelong loyalty, united to one another for life. It's designed at its very essence where your husband and wife are friends and partners through life, through the ups and downs. And the implication of that meaning, you don't divorce just because things get difficult, but instead you work through the issues together. Lastly, there's the issue of bodily loyalty, where he uses the terminology of one flesh, meaning that there is a union created and a bond of the hearts and minds with the bodies of these 2 people. Let me drill this down for a minute, because we've been sold a bill of goods about sexual intimacy that is a lie, straight from the pit of hell. Oh, it's just two bodies coming together. It's our animal instincts coming together. Let me just start with this for a minute. If you want to use that argument from like, hey, we've evolved from animals and done this, and I am not smart enough to understand this, so please don't come up and talk to me about it. Do you want to be compared to a monkey or a dog? I mean, seriously, it's the dumbest argument I've ever heard in sexual ethics on this. Oh, you're making something a bigger deal than it needs to be. You want to be compared to animals in the wild? It seems so silly to me. And God's design for this is way deeper than two monkeys procreating in the jungle. Thank you. I mean, I don't get it. Guys, sexual intimacy between a man and a woman is deeply intimate. And anyone who's ever been in a relationship, outside of a relationship with their spouse, will tell you, the moment that enters into your relationship with them, the complication level of the relationship just got multiplied by infinity. I mean, I have seen people nearly get married when they hated each other because they were sleeping with one another. Don't compound one bad mistake with another one that's got a lifelong commitment attached to it. And we treat it as if it's just not a big deal. Oh, it's just casual. We're just hooking up. We're friends with benefits. Are we trying to devolve back into the jungle? Because that's what it seems like. Guys, it's foolish to believe that intimacy and fornication outside of marriage won't have negative impacts on your relationships. Daniel Doriani says, the trouble with extramarital sex is that it is a life-uniting act committed without life-uniting intent. God's design for marriage is a deeply loyal commitment between two people centered around giving to one another, serving one another, forgiving one another, and choosing to love one another for life. And when you enter into that act with another person who is not your spouse, you have unintentionally communicated to that person, whether you mean to or not, you're ready to enter that commitment. And our current culture treats that communication far too flippantly. And not surprisingly, we're reaping what we sow. Now, not only has God designed marriage to look this way in regards to the relationship itself, but Paul teaches us in Ephesians chapter 5 that God also designed marriage to reflect the gospel. Right, in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33, we don't have time to have me read all that to you, but he unpacks the roles of men and women inside the relationship, and he's trying to explain to them how they can love and serve one another well as God has designed it, that the wife would serve and let her husband lead and respect him, and that the husband would love his wife so well that it would reflect Christ's love for the church. And what he means by that is that the husband lays down his own preferences and even his very life for the sake of his wife. So by the way, ladies, just for a second, because this is not super popular in our day and age. Okay, ladies, come to me. This seems like really unfair. It's like, well, God's not asking you to die, so I think we're good. Because that's what he's asking me. Like, if it comes to it, you're willing to die. And by the way, men, this has all sorts of implications. It means if you're stating on your wedding day that you love this woman and you're marrying her and you're willing to die for her, it means you take the trash out. That's like the lowest bar. Right? And so if God then gives these roles, right, he also then goes on to say in Ephesians chapter 5 that he gives these two to one another so they might sanctify one another. That marriage is designed by God, that this person sees your flaws most regularly and so intimately that they are regularly calling you to repentance and exhorting you, and you the same to them. And then ultimately, right, when you get to the end of this, he says that it is a profound mystery, and he's saying that it reflects Christ in his church. And what he's saying is that a godly marriage is designed by God not for a good time, but for his glory and our good. meaning the stakes are so much higher in marriage than your happiness or compatibility with a person. See, marriage has been hijacked in our current day and age, and we need to recapture God's intent for it. And we don't just avoid it because it's not self-centered, but we recognize the weight of how serious God takes this commitment the way the disciples do. And this will carry over into the way that we view sexual ethics, because intimacy is designed to be inside of the safety of a committed, loyal marriage. It's why Adam and Eve were with one another, naked and unashamed. How great would it be if Christians around the world recaptured a sexual ethic that allowed us to be unashamed about things? See, sexual intimacy was not created just for your personal pleasure, but for the bringing together of two people. Which this then leads us to need to answer this question: how do we move forward with what Jesus is saying here? The standard seems unbelievably high. The culture is not moving in this direction. My unbelieving friends and neighbors are not moving in this direction. My believing friends and neighbors are sometimes not moving in this direction. What do we do with this? And I think Jesus is giving the same invitation here in Matthew 5 that he gives anytime we're confronted with the reality where our lives and our way of thinking do not align with his teachings. And the first one is this: he's giving us an invitation to examine ourselves. Honestly, think about your own life. Think about what we've talked about this morning. Have I lowered the standard the way that the Jews had in Jesus' day? Turning marriage into something less than what it was? Turning sexual intimacy into something less than what it is? If you want to go deeper and dive deeper into this topic, right? Like let's say you're walking around like, I have still got a ton of questions about divorce and marriage. I would highly recommend Tim Keller's book, The Meaning of Marriage, to you. Right? There's a ton of good books on marriage, but that happens to be my favorite one because he does a good job of talking about the cultural things that are going on around us and how we carry into marriage a lot of the false views that we have, and how to let the Bible recapture what marriage is designed to be. But more than that, right, ultimately what he gets to in that book is this: marriage is not about your happiness and self-fulfillment, although those things can and do often happen inside of marriage. But marriage was designed by God ultimately to reflect God's love, mercy, and forgiveness to one another in the world. It's about friendship, which, if you remember correctly, Jesus calls his disciples what? His friends. It's a picture of what it looks like to be loved by God. Let me just say this. I'm going to dote on my wife here for a minute. A good marriage points you far deeper to Jesus than anything else ever could. I've read way too many systematic theology books. I spend way too much time listening to apologetics or thinking through theology. The thing that's most reflected Christ in my life is the love, mercy, and forgiveness of my wife. It's a tangible expression of God's grace to me daily. She could say, I'm not forgiving you for this. I'm not going to choose to love you for this, and yet she chooses to daily the same way that God promises he does to us in Christ. And I get that same privilege of modeling that to her. This is why God designed marriage in the first place. Maybe your questions this morning aren't around divorce and marriage, but it's around the idea of sexual immorality and adultery. And it's easy to say, well, I haven't committed adultery, I'm not even married, but Jesus widens that understanding to where I would imagine that everyone in this room is condemned with the standard that he set. Because Jesus is saying the citizens of his kingdom are held to a higher standard, and the desire for sexual intimacy is given to us by God, but the only proper place to enjoy it is inside of marriage. Anything outside of that dishonors God. But this is something key and important to remember about sin. It robs ourselves of joy. So I want to encourage you this morning to start at this place, to examine your own heart. And I'd submit to you that what drives us to struggle with these things oftentimes is really the 10th commandment. you're not familiar with that, Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, but coveting. You want something that you don't yet have, thinking that you need it. And if you find yourself sitting here this morning, examining yourself, and you're like, I stand condemned before what Jesus is saying, then here's the second invitation. It's the same invitation that Jesus gives to anyone who follows him. Repent. Admit you're wrong. Embrace his standards. And when you fail, throw yourself at his mercy, because the scriptures promise us that he is faithful and committed to you, meaning he will forgive you. You see why the loyalty and the commitment in marriage is so important? If it reflects the gospel, it's reflecting the promise that God gives us in Christ, that we are forgiven and loved and sealed by the Holy Spirit. Forgiven and adopted. It reflects that beauty to us, that promise to us. And then I want to encourage you to, in repenting and trusting in Christ, you walk forward, putting sin to death, ripping out your eyeball, cutting off your hand the way that Jesus says, and taking his word seriously. Because God promises he is with you as you put sin to death as well, through the power and the work of the Holy Spirit. And then I want to give you a third invitation. And that's to rest and experience contentment in him. Maybe you're here this morning and you're single and you really, really want to be married. I'm going to promise you something. If you can't learn to be content in your singleness, you'll never be content in your marriage. If you're here this morning and you're married and it's where God has you, you're called to be content with that person for life. And you fight for that contentment. You can rest in his promises and his goodness to you, because he promises that he is. And if you need him to heal something, ask him to. He loves to heal things. If you don't believe me, read the Gospels. It's healing all the time. I've seen God heal marriages. I've seen him heal lives. I've seen him heal people from sexual addiction. I've seen him restore people that have experienced divorce. I've seen him heal people who thought there was no hope for their marriage being restored. I've seen people experience adultery and brokenness of relationship, and God bring them a new spouse. God can handle it. Take it to him. Don't try to do it on your own. And lean into the rest of God so you might flourish and learn to love, live on purpose, and understand the meaning of why you're here in the first place, which is to know God and enjoy him all your days. A testimony to God's faithfulness to his mission, which is to see the gospel buried in the likeness of his death and raised to walk in newness of life.